Late one evening, a billionaire followed the woman who had quietly cleaned his home for years. But this time, something felt wrong. She walked alone through dim streets, carrying a worn-out bag he'd never seen before. The further she went, the more he realized he knew nothing about her life outside his mansion. And when she finally stopped at a place he never expected, what he discovered didn't just shake him, it shattered everything he thought he understood about loyalty, survival, and the silent weight of racism. But why was she hiding this from him, and what truth was she protecting? Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story is something you won't want to miss. Grant Anderson had spent most of his life believing he understood people. At 42, he was one of the most influential real estate developers on the East Coast, a man whose daily routine moved with machine-like precision. Meetings, reports, investments, charity events, every minute accounted for, every moment controlled. His world was built on numbers, order, and outcomes, and inside that world, the people around him had become roles rather than lives, faces he passed, tasks he expected, routines he never questioned. Among those routines was Jada, the quiet housekeeper who had moved through his mansion for nearly 15 years. She arrived early, left late, and never once disrupted the calm, polished rhythm of his household. Her steps were soft, her presence almost invisible, yet everything she touched carried an unmistakable care. Grant never wondered where she went at the end of each day. He never asked. He simply assumed her life was as stable and uneventful as the room she kept in order. But in recent weeks, that stability had begun to crack. Small items from his storage room were missing. Nothing valuable, nothing alarming, but enough to disrupt the predictable systems he relied on. Blankets, canned food, first aid supplies. Each disappearance subtle, quiet, and easy to overlook, yet impossible for him to ignore. Grant tried to reason through it. A mistake, a staff oversight, but every path led back to the same person, the one worker who had never given him a single reason to doubt her, Jada. He found himself replaying those small inconsistencies late into the night, unable to shake a feeling he couldn't name. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was the realization that he knew absolutely nothing about the woman who had spent years seeing the parts of his life no one else ever saw. And that realization would be the first step into a truth he was never prepared to face. Grant couldn't shake the unease building inside him. Days passed, but the same pattern returned. Small items disappearing, never enough to sound an alarm, always enough to disturb the perfect order he relied on. Every missing piece traced back to late-night entries on the household logs. Always the same hour, always the same person. The woman who had been a shadow in his home for more than a decade tried to bury it under schedules and deadlines, but the question kept returning. What was she taking, and why? The uncertainty wore at him until it became something sharper, something that pushed him out of his comfort and into a decision he never thought he'd make. One night, just after the mansion settled into its usual silence, Grant slipped into his car and parked a street away from his own estate. He waited, watching the dimly lit sidewalk where the staff usually departed. Minutes crawled by until he saw a familiar figure emerge. Jada stepped out quietly, carrying the same worn cloth bag he had seen before, one he had never bothered to question until now. Her steps were steady, unhurried, the walk of someone who had done this countless times without ever drawing attention. She headed toward the bus stop, not once looking back. Grant followed at a distance, his car blending into the late-night traffic. The route she took was nothing like the affluent neighborhoods he knew. With each block, the scenery shifted. Clean sidewalks replaced with cracked pavement, streetlights flickering over shuttered shops, the hum of wealth fading into the raw edges of the city. When she stepped off the bus, he parked far behind and continued on foot, keeping to the shadows. The buildings were older here, the air heavier. She moved with familiarity, weaving through alleys and side streets until she stopped in front of a narrow, aging building with chipped walls and rusted railings. Without hesitation, she went inside. Grant approached slowly, his heartbeat thudding with a mix of confusion and dread. Through the cracked window, he saw Jada unpacking items from her bag, canned food, blankets, basic supplies, and placing them neatly onto a long table inside a dim community hall. The room wasn't empty. Children sat on the floor, waiting patiently for her, their clothes worn, their eyes tired. Yet when she moved toward them, a quiet softness filled the space, something Grant had never seen in his own home. A realization struck him like a blow. These missing items weren't stolen for personal gain. They were taken because no one else cared enough to bring them here, because in this neighborhood, these supplies weren't convenience, they were survival. And Jada had been quietly carrying that weight alone. But there was something else beneath the surface, something he didn't understand yet. The bags she brought weren't just filled with food, they were filled with responsibility, sacrifice, and a story he had never asked to hear, a story shaped by the kind of racial and economic divides he had never experienced. Standing outside that building, watching a woman he had overlooked for years pour her heart into children, society ignored, Grant felt the ground shift beneath him. He thought he knew injustice. He thought he understood hardship. But this silent battle fought in forgotten corners of the city was a truth he had never been forced to face. And the deeper he looked, the more he sensed this was only the beginning. Something in Jada's life was unraveling, and he was about to walk directly into the heart of it. Grant returned the next evening, unable to shake the images he had seen, the quiet sacrifice, the hidden struggle, the weight Jada had carried alone. But when he reached the building again, something felt different. The door was slightly open, the lights inside dimmer than before. The air was heavier, urgent in a way he couldn't name. Inside, he found Jada seated on a worn chair, her posture tight, her breathing shallow. A small boy leaned against her, his face flushed, his chest rising with uneven effort. Papers lay scattered on the table beside them. Medical forms, overdue notices, empty prescription bottles, everything told a story he had never imagined, a story stitched together by years of doing everything alone in a world that offered her little in return. Grant stepped further into the room, his eyes widening at the severity of the child's condition. The boy's tiny frame trembled with each breath, and Jada's tired hands hovered protectively around him, as if shielding him from a world determined to overlook him. It wasn't just poverty, it wasn't just hardship, it was the crushing reality of a healthcare system where people like her were expected to survive with nothing, endure everything, and ask for help from no one. For the first time, Grant felt powerless. All the influence he wielded, the wealth he commanded, none of it mattered here. None of it could erase the years Jada had spent fighting battles he never acknowledged, navigating a world shaped by limits he never had to face. As he stood there, the realization struck him with a force greater than anything he had built or achieved. Jada hadn't been hiding from him. She had been protecting a child who depended entirely on her in a society that judged her skin before her struggle, and she had been doing it in silence. The room seemed to close in around him. The shallow breaths, the scattered forms, the weight of a truth he was too privileged to see. This moment, this fragile corner of a forgotten neighborhood, was where her reality collided with his denial. And as he watched the child fight for air, one terrifying question rose in his mind. Was he already too late to change anything at all? Grant acted without hesitation. The boy was rushed to emergency care, where the quiet chaos of medical intervention replaced the fragile stillness of that dim community room. Through the long night that followed, Grant remained in the hallway, watching the rise and fall of a child's breath behind a glass window, watching Jada sit with the weight of years on her shoulders. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a billionaire or a man in control. He was simply a witness to a truth he had spent years overlooking. When the boy's condition finally stabilized, a quiet clarity settled over him. The missing supplies, the late-night walks, the silent sacrifice, it was never about deception. It was about survival in a world that had never given Jada a margin for error, a system that expected her to endure quietly because of where she came from, the color of her skin, and the burdens she never chose. Grant had lived years surrounded by abundance, yet the woman who kept his home running had been fighting a war he couldn't see. In the days that followed, he made changes, not grand gestures for recognition, but meaningful ones. Resources flowed into the community center. Families received support without having to justify their need. Medical care, food programs, after-school help, things that should have been available all along were finally placed within reach. And in every action he took, he carried the memory of that night, the moment he realized how much injustice hides behind silence. But even with all he did, one truth lingered. Jada's story was not unique. It was the story of countless people forced to fight twice as hard for half as much, their struggles unseen until crisis forced the world to notice. And it leaves us with a question we can't ignore. How many lives are quietly breaking in the shadows simply because no one ever stopped to look?